All right, our next video is going to dovetail off of our last one, talking about racism and the idea of a systemic racism, but the more of the science and the biology implications associated with it. So we talk about the role of science in quotes there in systemic racism, and it's really bad science. But we've already kind of talked about the influence of knowledge and how people are susceptible to acting on knowledge that's not true, right? We all are. And how hard it is at times to discern what really is truth, what's a trustworthy source and what's not. But it really is something that we have to put an effort forward to do, right? If we want to move towards just society. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of bad racial science, only to kind of augment the kind of historical, legal history of systemic racism in the United States, and then kind of roll it over into the biology of the results of that systemic racism that we can see in marginalized groups. And that's the idea of weathering, that when we have chronic stress, we actually have measurable differences as a result of that stress based on the system that people are trying to live in, right? So it goes way back. Carl Linnaeus, this is, if you've taken a biology class and gotten to taxonomy, this guy's name always comes up. And he's the guy who was like, hey, everybody's talking about all these different kinds of life. We should have a system for naming them. And this is where the kind of the idea of a scientific name for an organism comes from. So for example, we are Homo sapiens, our genus, species. Those are levels of taxonomy. And that's specific enough to say, okay, that is a type of life. And he kind of took a swing at it and said, okay, let's try to categorize as much as we can. And included in that were human beings, so Homo sapiens. But he broke them down into the four groups that we've heard referred to classically as kind of the white European and other colors associated with different groups, right? It's not cool, but but that's now establishing a precedent, establishing a baseline that people kind of grab onto and run with. And so then you have Blumenbach, and in the late 1700s, he's the guy who was like, oh, let's call white people Caucasian. He personally thought the women of the Caucasus Mountains in Eastern Europe were the most beautiful in the world. So he called his race Caucasian after that. And again, it's weird how things stick, right? But again, people run with this. He also started the idea of kind of measuring skull sizes of different races to try to justify differences between them. And that's where Morton really comes in. And if you read the article that we talked about earlier on the biology of races, the National Geographic article, you get a bunch of details on his experiments at the beginning of that article. The idea that he was trying to measure the volume, the cranial volume of different skulls from different races and show that the white skull had the largest volume and hence the largest brain and hence must be superior. And of course, those were totally shoddy, crappy experiments. But again, going back to our pinky experiment, we are vulnerable to the ideas that are presented that are advantageous to us, right? So I'm more likely to believe something if it like puts me at an advantage, right? And there's this kind of as a natural knee jerk to that, but we do want to kind of work against that. We want to, if we're going to do good science, we need data, and we need to understand how things fit together. Now, more recently, we start to talk about experiments that have been done in the United States, right? Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, in the 1840s, he did all of his really brutal experiments on black women slaves, right? And this is where we started to evolve the myths that black people felt less pain and things like that that are absolutely not true. There's no biology to that at all. But again, people glob onto these ideas to justify their actions. And then we see the Tuskegee syphilis experiments where black men were deliberately inoculated with syphilis and received sham treatments and not told to watch how the disease would progress over their lives, right? And so this, 1972, this experiment's still going on, right? Like, that is our modern United States of America. Like, and so we have an issue here, right? So bad science still has influence, right? And again, as it props up those in power, it gets used as a tool to maintain that power. So this is a great quote from Chandra Komanika. And so if you listen to the Seeing White podcast, you'll hear him comment in there quite frequently. And I think he's just brilliant and just has such great insight. But he talks about the 17th and 18th century scientists got on board with the creation of race to justify enslaving human beings in a nation, the United States, founded in equality and liberty and freedom for all, right? So the US, I think, has the most elaborate scientific defense of human biological difference, right? So if you're trying to say that your system is about equality, but then can kind of point out why we don't see equality based on biology, you're going to kind of promote that. And that's not true, right? There is no hierarchy of biology among human beings. Like, we've already shown that we are pretty much the same. And this is the US, right? So it's funny because we go back, people talk about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, and I really think that, and there's lots of great things in the Constitution if it's applied appropriately, right? Like in the true spirit of what it means. Not, I think, what the Founding Fathers meant, which when they meant all, they really meant all other kind of land-owning white men, right? That was the all that they were including, because it certainly didn't play out over the last 200 years that all were given equality and freedom, right? So again, what we see is a history there that kind of promotes systems that are racist, okay? Now, how does that translate physiologically? Like, can we look at now the biology of the individual based on the systemic racist system that they're trying to survive in, right? So this is always a great time to kind of just think in general, because stress is going to be our focus point here, on what stresses you out, right? How do you know you're stressed? Are you mindful enough to recognize those stress points in your body and to try to deal with that? How do you go about dealing with your stress, short term versus long term? And we're going to see that's an issue as well. So take a couple minutes. It's a great discussion topic. It's just a great question to ask yourself and kind of touch base with yourself once in a great while, especially during these times that are unusual, right? Now, a great book, if you want to read more about that, is Sapolsky. So this is the guy that you saw in the video on the baboons, the baboon tribe that transitioned from kind of a hierarchical alpha male patriarchy to more of a society of matriarchy and equals. So that was him in the video, and this is one of his books called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it gets a little technical because that's how he writes, but it is rich in information about this idea of how stress works, right? How does the human response to stress work? How is short-term, how is it different long-term, and how the long-term or chronic stress can be damaging to us. And so there are other scientists who have coined the term weathering. And if you listen to the podcast from Code Switch on this one, you'll talk to scientists talking about this. And this is the term that we use for the measurable differences that we see on groups that experience chronic stress. So, for example, a quote from that podcast is, when you're in that store and all that stuff was going on, your body had a stress response. It's evolutionary, right? Your heartbeat picks up. Your body unleashes glycogen so you have energy to fight or flee. You might have felt anxious. You might have felt aggressive. Now we're learning the toll on this constant drumbeat can ruin your health. It might even cost you your life. And when they're talking about that, they're talking about the experience of many people of color. They experience when they're in a store trying to shop and they're targeted by the security officer simply because of their color, right? That's not something that I have to deal with often as a white man in America, right? It's something that other people deal with more frequently. And that, people say, oh, you know, when people then try to gaslight it or dismiss your experience, what they're not paying attention to is the fact that it does have an impact on you. And that's the idea of weathering, right? So the idea of short-term versus long-term stress is really important, because stress can be wonderful. Like, it can keep us alive, it can focus our attention, and that's how we evolved, right? And that's a good thing. But that mechanism wasn't ever meant to kind of be on all the time. And when it is on all the time, even at a low level, we just aren't built for it, and things start to wear down. I think that's such a great term, weathering, to describe it, right? Now, what you can start to look at are the results, right? And the fact that 2017 in America, a black woman is still 3 to 4 times as likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth, and that they are twice as likely to suffer a life-threatening complication, is a national disgrace. That's the United States of America, right? And we can partition that out, right? I know Serena had personal experience with that. I know my wife has a black female physician can talk to that, her experiences, and the friends of ours who are in the medical field who can speak to things. Again, it's a lot of unconscious bias, but that doesn't excuse it. And again, it is systemic, and that is why we have to raise our consciousness, our awareness of it, and recognize these measurable differences, right? So there's a short video then from that same documentary, specifically looking at kind of the molecular mechanism, one of the molecular mechanisms that we see in weathering, and that's shortening of telomeres. So that'll be on the website. You can take a quick look at it. Again, it's only about 5 minutes, but it's fun and it's a good watch. I like these; they're visual, right? So it's helpful in the learning process as well. And what that's going to take us back to again is the idea of epigenetics, right? That like the environment that I live in, under the right conditions, and those being what we brought up here now is this idea of chronic stress, can actually modify our DNA. Not its sequence, it's not a mutation, but modify our DNA chemically, so to change the gene expression. And for good or for bad, right? In this case, oftentimes bad. And that is a real mechanism, right? It's really working on people and having an impact, right? So there is a short video on the resources page for this that kind of outlines some of the mechanisms for epigenetics. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to delve deeper or ask questions. I'm happy to talk about it more. But it gets into a little bit too much for this kind of seminar class. But again, the idea is that you have your DNA encodes for genes. And we've already seen that our genes make proteins that do stuff. And that could be the development of an organism, or how we respond to anything, or abilities that we have or don't have. Now, that sequence is something that we focused on pretty much since we understood how DNA works, because that's the information to build the protein. But more recently, we've kind of looked at this idea that, oh, really what genes are turned on and to what intensity they're turned on can have a much bigger impact than we thought. And that a way to control that is to modify the DNA chemically, but not at the sequence level, right? So I'm kind of adding little tags to the backbone of the DNA and say, hey, you know what? This gene, we're going to put this away for now, okay? And that modification of gene expression then again has long-term effects and ultimately can be passed on to the next generation. And that's the thing that's kind of really remarkable, okay? So ultimately, when we come down to this is another great resource for you, talking about UW medicine doctors teaching doctors. They're talking about training of our next generation of physicians. And they're talking about social factors that impact health. And specifically, they bring up this idea that, you know, when you kind of get up to talk about your patient and say, what we have here is middle-aged male, black, you know, diabetic, whoa, hey, they want to say, hey, take a step back. It's like, what does black have to do anything? Because being black or being white or being any race doesn't have that much to do with your overall health, but biologically speaking, right? But the social factors that are associated with the concept of race in America do have an impact, right? So using race is a lazy proxy for social impact, for social factors that impact your health. And so many physicians and people in general just kind of fall into, oh, well, black people experience this more because they're black. Yeah, what you're saying is because they're black in America, experiencing a racist society, not because they're black, they have an African heritage, right? Or they have a gene that gives them more melanin in their skin. And I want you to think about that, and you really need to kind of pull that apart, right? So that's kind of the talk for today. I hope that's useful, food for thought, and hit those discussion boards, or let's talk more in class. Thanks.